we like to use an algorithm called March algorithm. This is a basic way of doing an assessment on a patient. Okay, these are some of just the finer points until we can actually get on scene. Now, when you do get on scene, one of the best things you can actually have in your medical arsenal is just using your eyes. All right, using your eyes, you can actually go ahead and tell a lot what's going on with your patient before you actually even get hands-on with the patient. So if I see my patient lying in a pool of their own blood, I know once I get to them that they have a bleed. And that's one of the main things in which I need to address first before anything else in which they may have. Because again, bleeding is the #1 way in which you'll die in a trauma-related situation. So at coverage 6 here, the March algorithm itself, what I'm going to talk about today is same thing as you would spell March in real life. So M-A-R-C-H, March algorithm. It was actually adopted by the military, and we use those same principles here. There's tons of different medical acronyms out there in the world that are great to distinguish wounds or how you should do basic treatment, but this is probably one of the more easier ones in which you can actually understand. So if we start with the M, M stands for massive hemorrhage. It's at the top because it's the #1 way you'll die. So it's a very, very, very important thing to understand. So with massive hemorrhage, that could go into the tourniquet use, in which we'll show you about a little bit later today in terms of stopping a bleed. That would be on all extremities, so anything for your arms and your legs. These are all massive hemorrhage wounds, all right? Common, especially particularly with knife defense or people that are getting attacked with knives. They usually end up a tendency of putting their hands up, and then they expose certain arteries like your radial artery here. If their hands are out wide, your brachial artery. These are all places which could be very, very bad and where you can die from, okay? So massive hemorrhage. We'll also talk about junctional hemorrhage wounds, where massive hemorrhage still comes into play. So that would be like the base of your neck, your axilla, your groin area. These are all areas where tourniquets are no longer applicable, and we actually have to get into some actual wound packing here. So we'll go over that as well. And then from once massive hemorrhage is done, we have to move on to A. So A is airway. Now, airway is actually a simple one. If you really want to understand whether or not your patient has an airway, simply ask them a question. Don't try to look for rise and fall of the chest or if they can breathe or like you hear them breathing or anything. Just ask them a simple question. That's it. Something simple as, can you do me a favor and come here real quick? And they usually will respond, or hey, what's your name? Or anything. They'll respond to you because it's a traumatic situation and you'll usually see them stuttering out a few words. You need to distinguish whether or not that means they can't breathe or they're stuttering because they're scared. A good chance is they just had a panic attack. I mean, real life stressful situations can cause that for a lot of people where they actually can't form a sentence just because they're so stressed out. So airway is pretty simple. Just ask a simple question and you'll see a patient coming along. This is also a way in which you can establish a mental status though. So airway is really a key. So once I ask you a simple question like, hey, do you know what happened? And they respond with something like, my favorite color is blue. That's a mental problem. So we'll go into airway and mental status and how it's actually applied. The R stands for respirations. So respirations is really simple. It's how fast or slow is my patient breathing? And this will tell me a lot. If it's high stress and my patient's conscious, that's pretty typical because of the fact they could be having a panic attack. So it's something which I can usually see, especially if there's not a lot of blood loss or anything like that. They could easily be having a panic attack. So there's one thing in which I want to distinguish, and then I just want to try and reassure my patient, something that's very, very underutilized in the actual medical field. Talking and reassuring your patient is probably one of the best ways you can do to keep them alive, keep them conscious, and keep them with a positive mindset that they're actually going to live. But if their respirations were slow, this becomes an issue. I want to know why. And probably the first thing I would do is check their pupils because I'm worried about a drug overdose. So slow respirations or shallow breathing, how much air they're taking in versus how much they're putting out or how fast it's going. These can all be very big indicators of whether or not they're losing blood or they might be ODing on drugs or anything of that nature. So respiration stands for R. Now the C is circulation. Circulation is also important because I want to know how much blood flow they got going to certain places, and we can establish this by a lot of things. One, we could do a simple tap refill, where you want that to actually refill within about 2 seconds. 3 is pushing it just a little bit, but we can still go with 3 and have a good stay. But also consciousness. So circulation will deal with a lot of consciousness. Blood flow needs to get to certain parts of the body to actually keep a person awake. So if you start to deal with a patient that is conscious and then all of a sudden they go unconscious, your patient is probably going into shock. So this is a bad, bad day. So circulation applies to that. Now there's a few ways in which we can check circulation. If it's a mass cash situation, we could do something really simple as just simply pressing the patient's thumb and releasing. You should see, if you do it to yourself right now while you're watching this video, you should see your thumb go from white to red, and that's just blood flow recirculating back into the thumb. We usually want to keep that with 2 seconds or less. We can go to 3. There's been studies to show different, but 2 seconds or less is usually what we want to do, and that means we have a good circulation throughout the body. Okay, another big way of actually determining circulation is really simple, is whether or not my patient is conscious, confused, lethargic, things like this. So if my patient is conscious and then all of a sudden they go unconscious, or they start to become very confused when they weren't confused, we might have a circulation issue, and we might also still be dealing with a wound that we missed, which is really, really big. So my patient might actually still be bleeding, and they're starting to head towards shock. This is a really bad day. So I always want to treat for shock or even prevent shock as best as possible. So circulation can actually be a very key indicator of what type of wounds I might be dealing with, especially if I came upon scene and I already had a patient that's in a pool of their own blood. Circulation could start to be an issue. So I always want to lay my patient flat, try to get them into a supine position. That just means lying them on their back so I can equalize their blood pressure and then assess them from there. The next one is H. H actually comes into 2 parts. One is a head injury. So that goes back to our airway and how we can assess a mental status. So if my patient did have a head injury, the very first thing I want to do is try to establish what their mental status is. And I can do that by simply asking a few questions, and I can also knock out the A part as well. And also hypothermia. Hypothermia is extremely important because it actually plays into the lethal triad. But in terms of the lethal triad, hypothermia is the one in which we could more than likely prevent or at least treat on scene. And it's always easier, 10 times easier to prevent hypothermia than it is to treat hypothermia. We could do that simply by, everybody does it every day actually, by just wearing clothes. You prevented hypothermia. Okay, so simple things which we want to do is always keep my patient covered up, get them off the ground. Be cognizant of how much of their clothing I cut off. I understand that I do need to treat all their wounds, especially if there is a massive hemorrhage, so I need to worry about that later. So if I do cut their clothing off, the second I actually stop the bleeding, I need to get them off the ground, and I also need to go ahead and wrap them up because I am worried about hypothermia and how much blood loss they had as well. So hypothermia is a very important key factor when it comes to treating our patient and also treating for shock. And these are just some of the basic letters for your March algorithm, in which we can use for a pretty simple assessment of how to save a patient's life. After we've gone through our rapid, then we can actually get into a more detail-oriented physical exam, where we've treated all life-saving wounds, and now we get into some of the little scrapes and boo-boos and things like that that weren't necessarily going to cause massive damage or even death, that we can treat now because it just goes towards patient care.